But what I'm going to talk about is the Africa mining vision in relation to South Africa. So we have turned. You heard what Edwin was saying. There is now this focus, this kind of wake up. I'd like to add a little thing to what Edwin said. Is during the boom, we had super resource rents. We had return on investment in the hundreds of %, right? Like in iron ore mining, etc. And what happens in the mining industry, because it has these super resource rents in boom times, and then it's in terrible fertilizer in slump times, is in the boom, they just wallow in their fat. Their costs shoot up, their procurement systems go to fertilizer, etc. And that's what we've seen. We've seen what too much fat does. Where the average return during the boom was most probably in the order of 80 to 100% return on capital, and the average on the stock exchange was 14%. And, of course, the state, we have no resource rent tax, wasn't capturing it at all. So, first, if we look at where minerals are in Africa, we see a kind of a concentration on the Kalahari craton, which is the combination of Karpval and the Zimbabwe craton. And we see big gaps where there is superficial cover, like desert sand or in the tropical basin in the Congo. So that isn't a reflection of where the minerals really are. This is a reflection of what we know. And most of Africa's minerals are still to be discovered, especially those that are under superficial cover. There's a big concentration in the south because that's where the best and most rigorous geological survey was. That's where we have at least a 250,000 scale quarter degree systematic maps. Other countries in Africa don't have that. In fact, Angola is only, well, a few years ago, I don't know, it was 20% covered, and it's bigger than South Africa. And this is where Africa's mineral reserves, not resources, this is reserves. This is where they stand in global terms. There's this great idea that I keep hearing at the PAP, the Pan-African Parliament, and AU, that we are so rich. We're not. We're not exceptional because we really don't know what we've got. I think we are exceptional, but in real terms, we're not. 20% of the world's surface. And you can see there, for really critical, the red ones, feedstocks into industrial development, the only one that we're really exceptional on is phosphate, and that's mainly Morocco. For the others, we're actually endowed below our percentage of the world's surface and below our percentage of the world's population. However, I think that given Africa's cratons, we will be proven to be exceptional, but right now we're not. And this just gives a quick idea of what we produce. A lot of it is from South Africa in most of these categories. And I've circled the ones that are crucial for local economic and domestic development, which aren't platinum. You know, even if our motor industry went back to 600 units per annum, right? The amount of platinum we'd use in AutoCAD would be less than 1% of global demand. And here I was quite surprised to see that if you use the same subset of defining what a minerals economy is, that means taking the commodity until it is a metal or intermediate, then South Africa is pretty much like the rest of Africa, which is on average a minerals economy at around 60% of exports. South Africa, I think, is 58%. So we're not that exceptional. And we are, as a continent and as a country and as a region, fall under the definition of a minerals economy, or what some people call a banana republic. Golden bananas, platinum bananas, coal bananas, iron ore bananas, but not fabricated, manufactured final products. quickly, if we look at the global context, and from the Second World War to the late 70s, we had minority world growth. That was Europe, the US, Japan, etc. Then we had a terrible period of 20 years of no global growth, the failure of global growth. All we had in that period was little, not dragons, but dragonflies, like South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. Total population of only 18 million, so it didn't impact on the global figures. They were tiny. And then we see the giants, the real dragons come, and that is China and India. And you see demand shooting up, collapsing when the Yankee Doodles crashed the world with toxic debt, and then picking up a bit and then easing off. And then you can see what happened to prices. This is mineral commodity price index from the IMF. And the failure, we have these really consistently awful prices, consistently $25 a ton FOB Richards Bay for coal, $22 a ton for iron ore, and then we have now Asian growth. So I believe we're on a higher level of demand. The total OECD population is less than that of China and India. So this is like, if we assume China and India are going to move to $30,000, $40,000 per capita, the world's going to need 3 times the amount of bananas. Sustainable mining is all about what you reinvest in other forms of capital. There was a fellow called Hartwick who came up with a Hartwick rule that said, you know, you start a mine. Remember, they don't create value, they deplete value. You start with $1 million of platinum in the ground, and at the end, you got a hole in the ground, right? You got no platinum in the ground. That if you want to remain in balance, you need to reinvest in other forms of capital, particularly infrastructure and skills. And then Solo later came up with the concept of genuine savings. And I can tell you, with the exception of Botswana, every country in Africa is dissaving. We're depleting more than we're reinvesting. And that's principally because of foreign investment. Because the bulk of the rents leave the country to reward the foreign investment, or leave the continent. Botswana is an exception because they have effectively a resource rent tax. They have a 70% tax on mining, 50% through a joint participation, and then normal income tax on top of that. So, also Solo's quote there is about not getting beaten up by our grandchildren, who are going to say, you lived well off the platinum, the gold, etc., and now we got nothing. So none of us want to get beaten up by our children and grandchildren. We need to be reinvesting this. And to reinvest it, we need to capture it first. And I saw the Davis Tax Commission disagreed with the IMF about the imposition of a resource rent tax. Don't know why, but they've come up with pretty much the old Treasury line on it. I would never thought that I would see as an ally the IMF, but it's happened. They're actually recommending we need a resource rent tax. So, is there such a thing as sustainable mining? Of course not. We're not stupid. We know mining always has a beginning and end. You start with a boom in Welkom and you end with a ghost town. Africa's full of Stilfonteins, Kabwes, Manguras, all over Africa. Mined out ghost towns everywhere. The only way mining can become sustainable is indirectly through the linkages, which is the Africa mining vision. So what are those linkages? Very quickly, downstream, upstream, side stream, and then really important that Edwin was talking about is around the partnerships between the stakeholders. The state, the private sector, civil society, communities, labor, etc. And then very importantly, the question at the beginning is, if we don't know what we got, we're going to be cheated, right? We need to invest in geoscience. We need to invest in knowing what minerals we have so we can at least start to strike a reasonable bargain with the mining company. And these are, just in summary, your fiscal. We score really badly there. We've got a very weak fiscal on minerals compared to many other countries. Spatial, we score very well. We have in South Africa used mining to put in most of our infrastructure, radiating from Gauteng, 35,000 kilometers of rail, our roads, our electricity grid, etc., was all put in by gold. And that is serving us well. So Joburg, thankfully, has not become a ghost town. Then your backward, which are critical. In fact, we found in a study we did a few years ago that the only countries that were ex-banana republics that had managed to industrialize, like the Nordics and others, concentrated on the backward. But you don't get the backward without the knowledge. So you have to concentrate on HRD and R&D, RDI, or you won't get the backward, because the backward is knowledge intensive. It's capital goods, mining machinery, equipment, etc., chemicals, reagents, etc. And then the forward, there you're looking at two things. The most important is not the platinum or the gold, etc. The most important are the feedstocks into your economy. As I said, we'd be unlikely to even use 1% of the 300 tons of platinum we produce, even if our motor industry was booming. In fact, we peaked at 14% of autocat, but we were exporting them under the with big subsidies from the MIDP. The most important forward is not the exotics like platinum. It is the mundane. It is cement. It is iron and steel. It is fertilizer minerals to increase yields. It is copper into electrification. In fact, it is fossil fuels into energy and also into petrochemicals. What are the main feedstocks globally used in manufacturing? They are steel, which is 15 times all other metals combined. Sorry, 10 times, not. Steel is 1.5 billion tons per annum, and all other metals together are only 150 million tons. And number two is polymers at 300. So your most important, look at the chair you're sitting on, it's made of what? Steel and polymers. This, steel and polymers. Your motor car is a lump of different steels and polymers, right? So those we need to get cheap, and we had monopoly pricing. Sasol, the old Boer Mafia, and ISCO, the old Boer Mafia. They priced at import parity prices. So for your basic feedstocks, we were blown out of the water before we started. And this is the same diagram that Edwin showed, but a few generations later. That is your value addition all the way to your intermediates manufacture, because the manufacturing sector can't use iron ore. It must be in the form, as we heard from Edwin, of fabrication, which is the intermediate feedstock that will go in. And those are the critical sectors we need to look at. And you can see there's no platinum, there are no exotics, there's no tantalum, no titanium. What is there are the critical mineral feedstocks into local domestic industrialization. And they are steels, polymers, base metals, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate, cement, aggregate, fossil fuels, and a few others. But those are your main ones. Then your next, that's your one link. But first, what happens? Most of it leaks out into global value chains. So 80% of our iron ore goes into steel in other countries. I don't even think we use 20%, but something like that. Then the one thing you get are the induced linkages. You don't have to do a lot to get them. That's the local spend in the local tuck shops, in the local shebeens, in the local supermarkets, etc. And there it's your national import dependence that comes into play. It's not particular to mining. if you are importing most of the shelves of a supermarket, the same will apply in the mining community. Then the infrastructure linkages, that's another one you get really without trying too hard. In some countries, you need to insist that it's open access at non-discriminatory tariffs, but in South Africa, they state-owned enterprises. So they're not privately run rails. Your next one is fiscal. This one we're very bad on because we have no resource rent taxes here. We have a kind of a very weak, weird one in our formula royalty. But that isn't even return on investment, it's a return on sales. And then from your fiscal linkages, you need to reinvest Hartwig and Solo in your knowledge linkages. And the most important, obviously, geo-knowledge, that you are discovering the new crop of mines for the next generation, HRD, STEM skills, and RDI, research, development, and innovation. The next is your backward, which is capital goods, consumables, services. I've split off utilities and construction. And there we've been losing ground. We're now importing about $2 billion, nearly 30 billion rand of mining inputs, which is way higher than it was. And that's what the PICIS is about. It's turning that around and building that supply chain. And then there are the lateral linkages, where if you look at other countries, as their mining industry went into decline, those input industries reinvented themselves. They start producing products for other industries, which we heard from other speakers this morning, etc. And that's lateral migration. And then all of this happens within a socio-environmental context of a country, of a region, and also into the global economy. So that's what the Africa Mining Vision is all about, is the realization of all 7 of these linkages. And as I said, we were most probably more advanced 20 years ago than we are now in their realization. Then this panacea about FDI. Normal mineral development. I'm not talking about conquered territories like Australia, Canada, where the locals were wiped out. So you can hardly say they benefited. You ask a Cherokee if he benefited from the mining laws of the US, he'd say definitely no. You ask an Aboriginal Australian, they'd also say no, no. I'm talking about normal development like China today, Malaysia, Europe, was in fact, they often excluded FDI in mining like China today does. They want FDI in manufacturing because learning through doing, copying, reverse engineering. But when you have resource rent, you say, don't worry, Mr. No, we'll look after that. Finland had it, Sweden had it. All of European countries generally didn't allow FDI in mining. Why? So Africa, we've made this historic, and we've moved towards it. Before there was very little FDI, but now we're suddenly dancing the FDI tune. You lose all your linkages. Your transnational companies can really dance around your internal revenue service completely. They have associated and secret companies in secrecy domains where they double the input costs. You have no control over it, especially if they're coming from tax havens like Glencore. Zug at 5% tax will always have an incentive to move profit to 5% from 28%. And then FDI, you get the perfectly normal dividend leakages. The dividends aren't respent in the country. They leak to whoever were the foreign investors. The backward linkages start getting broken, and you see it very clearly where we went the other way. We had local mining capital, and then in a moment of madness, we said, no, you can go to London, right? Or Sydney. The old Boere empowerment vehicle, Genco, Generale Mainbou and Union Corporation is now an Australian company. And they closed down their local linkages. Your forward, They have global processing. A local company doesn't have global processing. They're not doing this because they're bad people. They're doing it to optimize return to their foreign shareholders. So if you have excess capacity for nickel in Kristiansand in Norway, obviously you use it before you think of putting a refinery in the country. But local capital would never have that and would put it in, right? So we need local capital. Your knowledge linkages, we saw very clearly when the old Gencor Joburg Technology Center was closed down and all of the 200 personnel were given a choice of either go to kangaroo land or take a package. So again, they concentrate, which makes sense to them. But the linkage, so you lose the linkages. And finally, there are always political downsides to having foreigners on your prime national resources. It's going to lead to political discontent. If all the high rent natural resources are owned by foreigners. So, nevertheless, that's why in mining, this needs to be in the regulations. In the regulations, up front to an investor, you have your resource rent tax, right? Like Zimbabwe does, like Mozambique does, like Papua New Guinea does, etc., etc. You need to build all of these in because under the markets, they won't happen. And we see that. They don't happen if you have a free market outlook. Okay. Also, you need to concentrate. Okay, temporarily take FDI, but start building local mining capital. Just a quick Canadian calculation looking globally. For every 1 million invested in geoscience, in systematic geological survey, will result in the discovery of new resources with an average in situ value of 125 million. And we are contracting. Our CGS used to be one of the best in the world and is now under stress. I'm just going a bit faster. Illicit financial flows from Africa are now greater than the total FDI plus ODA, overseas development assistance. And South Africa is number 2 after Nigeria. This is just quickly rehashing. Those are the critical minerals. And then you look, really, if you're looking at beneficiation, first, of course, there's upstream into mining input suppliers. It's not that complex. It's actually only 6 groups. Your ferrous, polymers, base, fossil fuel, cement, and NPK. That's what we need to be making sure. Go into our economy at the cheapest possible price. And if you look at development, in the 80s, the cheapest steel in the world was always South Korea, POSCO. And the next 20 years, it's always Shanghai. So it means every manufacturer in China has a slight advantage over the rest of the world. Instead, the opposite pertained to South Africa. They were being charged, on average, 30% more. So how can you compete if your basic raw materials are going in at monopoly prices from Sasol, ISCO, and others? Even the IDC was involved in phosphate monopoly pricing, but they stopped. Critical constraint is scale economies. The problem is the only way you're going to get competitive prices is by competition. But because of scale economies, it's difficult to have. For rivalry, they always say you need 5. We don't have the market in South Africa for 5 world-scale steel producers, nor for polymer producers. And that's a problem, which is why we need the region. The Southern African region, SADC, is a bigger market for mining inputs, double, in fact, than Europe. It's double the European market. So whilst we're only 1% for motor vehicles or auto catalysts, we are 200% for this. It's an opportunity waiting to be taken. So we need to move to a regional dispensation. The SADC is over 70% of all mining in the whole of Africa. And if we really want to grow the inputs, we need to create bigger markets. Now I've just got to go, but I'm not going to go through all of the reasons. And we need to develop a regional mining vision by cascading down the Africa mining vision. This is just an example where you can see all the African regions. If you look at them at a region, they all have the economies of scale for steel, except maybe not EAC, which is about $2 billion. You couldn't really have several steel companies. But if we're going to go into a regional dispensation, we're getting a lot of pushback, obviously, from the weaker economies. We need methods of leveling the playing field, and what's been recommended here is you have regional local content recognition based on the inverse of GDP per capita. You have regional development funds targeted to the weaker economies, not to South Africa, logistics, and infant industry protection. And this would just give you an example of SADC, where you can see that if you had such a system based on the inverse of GDP per capita, South African capital goods would count 66% in, say, Zambia. But Malawi would count 90 because they're the poorest, and Mauritius would only count 50 because they're the richest. And this could also be done in terms of funding. So a South African company would only get, for a PFS to do a backward linkage, would only get 41%. But Zimbabwe would get 82%. So, and as those countries move up, of course, the bias would move against them. Shoot through the actual vehicles because I've run out of time, and I'll just go to the whole. This is an RMV, a regional mining vision, where we have a common outer tariff for inputs and feedstocks, a bit like the old European. Before the EU, you had EXA, the European Coal and Steel Agreement, 1951, the Schuman Plan. They first went to a subset like this before going big bang with the Rome Agreement. What's being suggested is we go for a subset of win-win before going into greater integration, and those are the key interventions. This is a quick recap of how everything fits together. This is the old slide that you saw, and infrastructure, and then, of course, your feedstocks into manufacturing. And this is something I did for the Africa Mining Vision, so it's in the Africa Mining Vision, and this just shows through looking at phasing of mineral sectors, starting with just a hole in the ground to China or to Europe, right? Enclave development would be phase one, moving to resource consumables and HRD, moving to resource RDI, capital goods and services, the inputs, and finally getting lateral migration into completely diversification. And in all of them, you start with importing the technologies, you move to developing the technologies, you import the inputs, you start making them, you start with totally unskilled labor, and you move to skilled labor. You start with a tax base that's purely off the mining contract, and you move to diversified tax bases. And that's where South Africa, let me go back there. That's where South Africa was, in my opinion, and that's where we then moved to. I think we're now between those two, and we hope to reverse that and move back up. And I would put Finland, which was a banana republic in 1980, it was forestry and minerals, and today they're completely industrialized, as an example where they're right at the end. So I believe the opportunity is ours for the taking. We only need to grasp it. I should mention something on the mining charter. For all its problems, and I'm not going to go into it, it is, in broad terms, a move towards the AMV, especially around the supply chain. However, I'm not going to say it's a wonderful document or a terrible document or I get shot by people, but it is overall a progressive move. It could be better worded, etc., but it is moving towards the realization of the linkages. And my final slide is just for everyone to read and see if it rings any bells. Thank you.